Sorry, I'm just banging things here.
Sorry, you're just doing what?
I was just banging things around. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. Anza, welcome. Can you all hear me well? Maybe just give a thumbs up if you can hear me well so that I know. Thank you. That's great. Okay, so I seem to be coming through.
Yeah, I'm still looking for the thumbs up.
Okay, I think I'll maybe kick off and start, if that's all right with everyone. Welcome to this mentoring circle. And thanks, Nolene, for inviting me again to be part of this. I look forward to these sessions very much. Yes, my name is Mark Turpin, and Nolene has invited me to come in and work with the mentoring circle from time to time on important themes and topics. And I work as a coach, learning consultant, part-time lecturer at Wits Business School. And I work with communities of practice, this mentoring circle, and groups of people to facilitate learning processes, essentially. And I believe that learning is so important for professionals these days. All of us who see ourselves as professionals have to engage in continuing and lifelong learning, having a coach, participating in circles such as this one. Also, the Geological Society obviously runs a wide range of events that I've seen, and if you have the opportunity, a lot of them are, I think, free of charge. So if you have the opportunity to participate in some of those activities, I think it's also a very good way to think about your continuing learning as young professionals. So I'm passionate about the learning process, as you can gather. And today, we are going to explore the question of feedback, giving and receiving feedback. And we're going to work through until about 2:30, if that's okay. I'm going to share some of my thoughts and ideas about the feedback process. And then we'll have a chance, probably in the last half hour or so, to have lots of questions and discussion. But if any of you want to raise particular questions along the way, just raise your hand. I'm not quite sure how it happens here. Yeah, but raise your hand and I'll recognize you in the course of the conversation. So thank you for being here. Yes, welcome to you all and for taking the time to do this. I'm going to then start talking, first of all, just a little bit about feedback generally. And the importance of feedback. And then I'll go on to look at the two areas of, I think I'll start with receiving feedback, but then also look at giving feedback and ways to do that as well. So my general thought about feedback is this, that feedback is one of the most useful sources of information for us as professionals in terms of how we work. Getting direct feedback from colleagues and other people, one of the most useful sources of information. And yet at the same time, very often we fear it. We can be afraid of getting feedback. We can be afraid of the conversations, performance reviews, and so on, where feedback is given, which is really strange because it's a wonderful source of information, and yet we fear it. And very often we fear feedback because of the way that it's given. It's not given in a supportive way. It's given in what tends to be a fairly critical kind of way. And we feel very often beaten down by the feedback, or that people are just pointing out what we do badly or what we are not so good at. So it tends to be very often given in a negative way, as a result of which we then fear the feedback conversations that are given, particularly in the performance review conversations that sometimes happen at work. So we have to somehow learn to embrace feedback and receive it and give it in good ways that work for ourselves and for other people, and to reframe, if you like, the feedback conversation in a positive way. And sometimes it's the most negative and critical feedback that is the most useful in an odd kind of way. It's the most useful feedback. You know, it's all very well if people say, Mark, you did really well when you did this or that. Thank you, it was great, we loved it. That's really nice to hear. But it doesn't actually necessarily help me to improve. It helps me just to stay doing what I do and doing the best I can. And also I want to improve. And sometimes it's the more negative or critical feedback or the areas of improvement that I need to hear and that are really going to support me to be even better at what I do. So in some occasions, it's actually quite useful when somebody says to you, you did really well, Tabo, or Anza, that was really brilliant. It's useful then to respond by saying, thank you so much for that feedback. And is there anything that I could have improved? So when you get good feedback, sometimes to even request and ask for something that is a bit more critical or that can help you strengthen how you perform. So now I'm just looking for some feedback, guys and gals. So maybe how do people feel about what I'm saying so far? Are we making a good start here? And please don't be shy, because I like the engagement and interaction. And I'm very comfortable with silence as well sometimes. Yeah.
No, thank you very much. It's a nice presentation so far. So thank you.
And Tabo, do you connect with what I'm saying? Is this helpful?
Yes, it's very helpful.
Okay, you understand the point I'm making about how sometimes we fear feedback. Yeah, because it's not always given in a good way. That makes sense,
and
Tabo?
yes, and sometimes it's bad news.
Yeah.
So that is why it sort of come in a negative way, because the bad news is something that we don't actually want to hear a lot of times. So that is why we tend out being not good from that feedback.
Yeah, yeah. So the other difficulty sometimes is that at work, sometimes the only time we get feedback is in that performance review conversation. And sometimes it can even be linked to a bonus or a reward if it's good, or not getting a bonus or a reward if the feedback is not so good. So, and we only get that conversation maybe once a year at performance review time. So we see feedback as something that just happens then and focuses on our areas of weakness and is not always very helpful, because we know where we're not so strong anyway. Usually we know. It's not usually a great surprise to hear that feedback. And so again, we have to maybe think about feedback as a conversation that can happen not just at the time of the annual performance review, but that's something we try and engage with ourselves as often as possible, with work colleagues, with managers, or with people we manage, but to make the feedback conversation a much more normal way of engaging and interacting with each other, so that we take away some of the fear and take away some of the challenges of doing. You an example. If you do a presentation, for example, at work, or anywhere, if you are facilitating a conversation as I'm doing now, when you finish, try and get some feedback from somebody who was there. Ask people, how do you think I did today? Was it good? Was I effective? Was there anywhere I could have, how I facilitated the session? Or is there anything I could have strengthened in my presentation? Ask people for feedback is a very good idea, because you then get some real feedback in the moment from people, and it can give you information about your performance. So I like to make it a habit of asking for feedback from people, because if you do it regularly and consistently, asking people to give you feedback, you then start to build up a really good picture of how you are and how you show up in the work that you do. So I think asking people for feedback is a really good idea and gives you a lot of information about how they see you. The other thing that I should say about feedback, of course, is that you don't have to always accept it. It's always a choice. This question of feedback that you receive, it's always a choice for you about what feedback you think is really useful and important and that you recognize as valuable. And maybe sometimes you get feedback that you think, actually, that doesn't help me much, and I don't actually believe it, or I don't accept it because other feedback I get from other people tells me something different. So as you get more and more feedback by asking people how you are doing, you start to get a good picture of what people really think. And it gives you a standard by which you can decide which feedback is consistent with other feedback that you get, and which feedback seems to be a bit of an outlier or less useful. Because if you get consistent feedback from different people that you always behave in a certain way, or you always got this funny way of presenting that distracts people, or whatever it is, if it's consistent feedback, then you probably need to take it seriously. But if you just get one piece of feedback and it is not consistent with what other people are saying to you, it could still be helpful, but it's probably less likely to be completely real because other people are telling you something different. So the consistency of feedback gives you a way of making decisions for yourself about which feedback you want to accept and work on, and maybe some feedback that is less useful for you or less important. Does that make sense? Any questions where we are so far? Nolene, you feel good about this so far? Makes sense. Yeah. Anyone else? Does it make sense so far? Muketwa. Yes, what do you think?
Hello.
I see your hand up. Yes, hi, welcome.
How are you?
You're breaking a little bit somehow. You're breaking.
Now is it
It is
better?
better. Yes, yes, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I have a question that I want to know if confident
Muketra, you're still breaking up. You're still breaking up quite badly. Could you put the
does have
question in the chat?
a negative feedback? Am I audible enough now?
You're breaking up quite a lot. And I'm just wondering if it could be possible for you to put the question in a chat. Would that be okay?
Oh, okay. Okay, yes, I'll do that. I'll do that.
And then I'll come to you. Thank you. I'm sorry. It's just you're breaking up quite a lot. Yeah. If you put the question in a chat, that would be good. And then I'll follow that as well. Yeah. Other questions from anyone else at this point?
No, no problem.
You're all okay. Good. So let me go into a little bit more detail around receiving feedback when you get feedback. As I said just now, it's always going to be a choice as to whether you want to really take on board the feedback or not. You don't have to take on the feedback if you think it's wrong or if you don't believe it, or if it is not consistent with what other people are saying. It's always a choice. Though I would say this, that if you get feedback from, for example, your direct supervisor or a senior person in the business, then just because of their seniority or because they are your manager or your supervisor, you probably should attach a little bit more weight to that feedback because it's coming from somebody who is quite important in your professional life. So I think you also need to think about who the feedback is coming from. And that can also help you to think about how important it could be for you to take that feedback seriously. Yes, Muketra, thank you. I can see your question now. Do I think self-confidence has an impact in terms of accepting a negative feedback? It can do, because if your self-confidence is low at a particular point, or you're just dealing with a lot of stuff in your life at the moment anyway, and then somebody starts piling on top some negative feedback, then it does have an impact. You may be very reluctant to receive it. And I would also say this, that, if you're getting feedback from your manager, you probably just have to accept it, even if it's negative or critical. But if a colleague comes up to you and says, oh, can I give you some feedback, Muketra, on this or that? But it's not your manager, and you don't really feel in a good place at that time to receive that feedback. You say, look, thank you for offering the feedback. At the moment, I'm not in a really very good place to receive it. So could we postpone the conversation for another time? You're allowed to do that. I think the point about feedback generally, and this comes to the giving side of feedback, is that really you should ask people for their permission before you give them feedback. So Muketra, I could say to you, thanks for your great question. Can I give you a little bit of feedback about it? So ask for permission first. And if they say, look, I don't really want to get much feedback at the moment, then you have to respect that and then say, maybe we'll have the conversation at another point. But people who are giving feedback well would usually ask first if they can give feedback to somebody. and not just give it out of the blue. It's not a good way to give feedback to people, because you might be hitting on a sore nerve, or you might be doing it at a bad time for the person that you want to give your feedback to. So you have to be careful in that sense, as somebody who gives feedback, to make sure that the person who's receiving it is in a good place to receive that feedback at that moment. I think that's quite important. Muketra, does that help? I hope so. Yeah. And also generally, of course, you know, to be effective in the workplace and to have these kind of conversations generally, sometimes you do need a bit of a thick skin and to develop the self-confidence to be able to accept it. Yeah. I think self-confidence is important, but also when you're giving feedback, to recognize that the time has to be right and somebody has to be in a good place to take on board the feedback at that time. Yeah, so thanks very much for the question, Muketra. It's an important one, I think. Receiving feedback, yeah, to think about who's actually giving the feedback sometimes. Because if it's going to be a manager or a supervisor, then you probably need to take the feedback a little bit more seriously. Your supervisor is supposed to be concerned about your performance, and if they feel that you're slipping up somewhere, then it's good to know it. Yeah, so the other thing I think is that when you are in the feedback conversation, to somehow looking at the person who's giving it to you, to think about how this person can actually support you. That generally they are not horrible people, your managers or your supervisors. They are usually people with a degree of wisdom and who would like to see you performing well. And to frame it in that context, that any feedback then you get from them is done generally, not always, but generally with the intention of supporting you to perform better, generally with the belief that you can add value to the business, and that this is why they're giving you feedback. So they're not giving you negative feedback because they hate you, or not because they dislike you or anything like that. It's because they want your performance to improve. Generally, I mean, sometimes there are some horrible people around, but most people would want to give you critical feedback sometimes, and also positive feedback, but critical feedback because they want you to improve. So to frame in your head that even though this feedback might be difficult to hear, it is being given to you with a good intention because somebody cares about your performance and wants you to improve. And if you go into the feedback conversation with that mindset, that this is really aimed at helping you to improve your performance, then I think you'll approach the conversation in a better way and you will be more receptive to the areas for improvement. If you have that almost reframing idea in your head that people are there to support each other at work, and feedback, even if it's negative, can sometimes be really valuable. And that the person giving it is not your enemy. They want you to perform well. Yeah. Any questions about that? Any thoughts? Don't be shy. Oh, you're all very quiet. Maybe this is the graveyard shift today. We're coming towards the end of the week, people. Okay, do put your hand up if you want to ask a question. So I think that's on the one side of receiving feedback, to approach it in a positive way, to actually seek out opportunities to get feedback from people. And if the feedback is just, oh, well done, you did fine, that's very good, then sometimes to probe it a little bit with somebody and say, is there anywhere I could have improved or anything I could have done better? Because that will help you more sometimes than just somebody saying, oh, you did well. I did well, thank you, but how could I have improved? Is there anything I could have done even better? That's going to be really useful information. And part of the feedback conversation is to gather information for yourself from how other people see you and how other people experience your performance. Such valuable information to have. Yeah. And of course, the other thing is that if you are in a group of people, if you are making a presentation or writing a document for a group of people or something like that, asking for feedback, start first with the people that you trust, with the people you know that will give you honest and genuine feedback, which is going to be very real then, because they care about you and they trust you. So seek out good feedback from people that you trust and ask them then for areas where you can improve more. That makes a really good source of information for yourself about how you perform. And then increasingly, once you're comfortable with having received good feedback from people and sometimes more critical feedback, you can broaden it out to even people that you're not so sure about, asking them for feedback as well. Once you become comfortable with the idea of working with and receiving feedback. This is all on the receiving side, of course, receiving feedback. And then also, because it's always a good conversation, in fact, these feedback conversations are sometimes the most important conversations that we have at work. So we have to move beyond fearing them. These are the most important conversations that you will have as a professional sometimes in your working life, is when people are giving you feedback. And also to recognize that because we all need feedback, to sometimes be able to offer it to yourself, to other people, to give them feedback about how they are doing. Because you have a role as a professional person for your own learning, but also to support other people with their own learning, people in your team, people that you work with, even sometimes giving feedback to your own manager. It can be a very powerful conversation. But we have to learn how to do it well. So I think when the time comes for you to give feedback to somebody else, I would say that, as I said a little bit earlier, it's always good to start by asking them if it's okay. So I could say, Pilar Sunday, is it okay if I give you some feedback? Before I do it, ask for permission. Nolene, would you be okay if I give you some feedback on how this has gone today? That kind of thing. Always ask for permission first. Because then you give somebody the chance to, well, they might say yes, in which it's fine. Or they might say, actually, at the moment, I don't really feel in a very good space to hear feedback from you, but I would like to get it. Maybe in a few days' time, I'll feel a bit stronger. But you give them the permission to say that by asking first. So feedback should usually only be given to somebody once you have their permission to do it. Don't just do it out of the blue. So, is it okay if I give you some feedback? Is really always the starting point. And so that's the first thing I would say. Then the second thing I would say is, because sometimes people can be fearful of getting feedback, to try and do it in a way that people are comfortable to accept how you are giving that feedback. And I often start by saying that a really good starting point is to tell people what they're doing really well. and then to focus on how they could maybe even strengthen it further is a good way to give feedback. That if you're only focusing on how they can improve, it could be seen as a bit negative. But to start by just talking about what people are doing really well, and then to focus on how they could improve or even strengthen further what they are doing. This is referred to sometimes as giving appreciative feedback, which notices the great things people can do and how they are working in such a good way, and also focuses on how that can be even strengthened or developed further, is a way of thinking about appreciative feedback. Because so often at work, you know, if you talk to people, they say, well, nobody ever values us for the work we do. We're not valued by the business, and we only get negative or critical feedback. So there is a huge need in our businesses to help people to feel fundamentally valued at work, even if there are some areas where they could strengthen or improve what they do. So to start by telling people what they're doing really well, and then how they could even improve it or strengthen it. I'll give you an example. So if you're delivering a presentation, for example, and you want some feedback at the end, if you just do it in the normal way of focusing on what people don't do so well, you say, oh no, you were too quiet. You were too quiet in the presentation. Which is really just to focus on the negative thing and the thing that you could improve on. Whereas a way of doing it differently would be to say, I think you could say, for example, I think you paced the presentation very well, and your slides were brilliant and what. And sometimes I think you could have spoken a little bit louder to make sure that everyone, even at the back of the room, heard properly. So that's a way of giving people feedback which they will be more receptive to, because they know that you saw aspects of their presentation that you thought were very good. And you also know that there were some areas where they could have strengthened it. So it's taking a holistic view and giving that to you in the feedback, not just focusing on the negative side of things. And this is perhaps the big mistake that happens in many of our businesses, is the feedback conversation only focuses on the negative and does not start by valuing the good work that people are doing day in and day out, and how that can be strengthened and improved. So I think what I'm saying is that we have to almost move away from the idea of feedback that is positive or negative, and think about feedback that is always positive and always seeking to strengthen and build the other person. So there's nothing negative in saying you could have spoken a little bit louder, unless you just leave that as by itself as the only feedback you give. But if you give it as part of a general conversation that is valuing the other person and seeks to strengthen them, then we take the negativity out of it in some ways, and we start with valuing, which is the more positive side, and then the negative side is not so much negative, but seeking to strengthen and improve. So feedback should be about valuing and then strengthening and supporting the other person to do even better. We take the negativity a little bit out of it and make it a really valuable conversation in a holistic way, I think is really the way to do it. And I encourage people to think of it like that, whether you're on the receiving end or the giving end, to think about what is the value that I can get out of this feedback conversation, and how can I make a feedback conversation valuable for the other person if I'm giving the feedback. This is a way of reframing the feedback conversation in a way that we can start not so much fearing the feedback, but actually embracing it and looking for it and seeking to have feedback conversations as much as possible every day in our working world. So questions, people? Is this helpful? I need some feedback now. Bubulelo, yes. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Mark. No, this is really very helpful, especially for me. Like whenever I do a presentation, I'm always so anxious, and I think whenever someone comes with a positive and a negative, it will help balance how I like eventually take that feedback. So yeah, I think I also just apply that when I do also at some point in my career do give feedback, just to balance the good with the bad, because I've gotten some pretty blunt feedback in the past, and it really does nothing for my confidence at all. So yeah, that's very helpful, Mark. Thanks.
Thank you. And the thing is that you can think of it sometimes as like a glass of water. The glass is always actually at least half full. But when people are giving you feedback at work, often they're focusing on the empty part of the glass. And saying you need to do more of that, or you need to do that part better. But they're not looking at the half of the glass that is actually full, where you've actually performed quite well. And the difficulty with that kind of approach is that what people focus on is often going to grow. So if people always focus on the things that you're not so strong at, you'll think that that's the only thing that's important in the workplace. And it may be the part of the job that you don't enjoy so much or whatever, but you get really anxious because people are just focusing on that part of the glass. Whereas if people start by saying, look, there's this bottom half of the glass where you perform so well, and I really like that. And I would like you to use more of what you're doing there to try and address some of the other areas in the glass that we could fill. That's going to be much more empowering.
That's true.
And you feel better and stronger and valued if people also mention the bottom half of the glass, and more empowered and motivated to try and fill up the glass with what you can do. So thanks, Nompumelelo, for your question. The question from Neo in the chat, I think it would be encouraging to hear a story of a place where you feel you can improve as well, or recently heard some feedback. Yes, it is intimidating to know that we are so green. And if you don't mind, it might be encouraging to hear something for someone. So, okay, I'm trying to get your question, Neo. Thank you for that. You're asking me to give an example or two, I think. I just want to check so that I understand. I understand what you're saying. Neo, you want me to give an example, is that right? Yeah, an example. So I'm trying to think. I mean, even an example is this case in point here, this mentoring circle. And this is, I think, the second or third one that I've done. And in this context, I really need good feedback to know whether this is working, but also maybe to know if there are some areas where I can improve. So I'm even asking you guys now. I mean, for example, one of my questions is, am I speaking too quickly? I'm conscious that I speak in English, and it may not always be the first language for everybody. So I need to be very conscious of whether I'm speaking too quickly or too slowly. And I need feedback on that. So if I get that feedback, then I can work to improve how I'm doing. Or if there's anything else that maybe I'm a bit blind to, or I don't see in terms of how I facilitate this circle, then it's really good for me to, and I really value getting some feedback or ideas about how I can improve it or strengthen it. So Neo, that's a very immediate example that I'm giving you in some ways. But in the moment, feedback, so right today, now, feedback is very valuable. Whereas if sometimes I don't get any feedback and then 6 months later in a performance review, somebody says, Mark, you know, that mentoring circle, you really messed that up. I can't even remember then how that mentoring circle went 6 months later. So it's too late. So feedback is always valuable in the moment, in the conversation, as a way of being able to change things quickly and easily. And it's also very focused on the immediate challenge that we face, which is how we connect and so on. So Neil, that's a question I have for you now. Am I speaking too quickly or too slowly? What do you think? Or is there anything I can do to improve how we're doing? So Neo, I'm asking you a question now. You enjoy it. I'm really glad. And then my second question, which is always the important one, is anything that I can do to improve, Neo, how we're doing? Am I speaking too quickly, too slowly? How does it work for you? And Muketwa, I'll come to your question as well. My talking speed is okay, thanks, Neo. That's very valuable and helpful to hear that. Because I am conscious that we all speak with different first languages, and that can be challenging sometimes. Muketwa, I'm fearful when it comes to giving a feedback. I would be having a feedback, but get scared to say it because I sometimes undermine myself. What advice can you give me to actually improve on that? So this is about knowing that you have some feedback that could be useful, but get scared to say it because you might undermine yourself somehow. What advice to actually improve on that? I think that's a good question. I think a starting point, Muketwa, is always to recognize that most people, most of the time, want feedback and desire feedback because they want to improve. So the first stage, I think I'd go back to my advice a little bit earlier, always ask somebody if they would like to get some feedback first. And if they say yes, they are giving you permission. They're giving you permission to then give feedback, which means that they want it. And I think that can help you be a little bit less scared or a little bit less anxious that this person actually wants feedback from you because you've asked them first. And I think that will help. And then the other thing that you can do when you actually get into giving somebody feedback is to say, look, it may be that I don't completely understand, or I'm not completely sure about whether this is real, but I just want to test out with you what I think. So to really, you start exploring the feedback with the other person just to say, am I getting it right? It seems to me it's like this, but I'm not quite sure. So explore it with them. And see what they think, rather than just make a bold statement that may or may not be the full picture, or you may or may not be completely sure about, but to turn it into a conversation rather than just one sentence. but to say, how does it feel if I say this? Make it a conversation and explore it rather than just make it a bland statement, I think is a way of approaching it. So to own your own insecurity sometimes about it is fine. You won't be undermining yourself because other people want the conversation, usually. People want to hear feedback. Yeah, and look, sometimes if somebody might say, I'm not sure if that's right, what you're saying. If somebody says that to you, you could say, well, maybe get some feedback from other people as well, because it's only my view. But maybe some other people could also give you some feedback on this and see what they say. I think that's always helpful, because then that person is getting feedback not just from you, but maybe from other people as well. And then they can decide, well, this seems to be consistent. Other people are saying the same kind of thing, or other people are saying something different, which is also okay. You have to recognize that everybody is looking at you from a different angle, and you are looking at other people just from your angle. So that's why getting all-round feedback and offering feedback and suggesting that people get all-round feedback can be very valuable, and takes the pressure a little bit off yourself as well. Yeah, it seems, Nompumelelo, some of you have had feedback that is a bit negative in the past. Yeah. Nolene.
Thanks, Mark. I'm finding this absolutely fascinating. And
okay.
everybody, you're so right. Feedback is a struggle, and it really is hard. But one of the things Mark said earlier that I found incredible was that you need to take the feedback where it comes from. And, even if it's your manager or your other colleagues, they don't always know how to give feedback. So
Yes.
they should be on this mentoring circle as well, I think.
Yes, very often the people who are giving feedback not in a good way, they've never been trained how to do it. They don't know how to do it well. So they just focus on seeing feedback as somewhere where I can criticize my people. And the funny thing is, I'll come to you in just 1 second, Owen, but the funny thing is that we employ people because we think they're great, and we think they are the best of the people who applied for the job. So when we employ people, first of all, we're recognizing all their strengths and everything they can do for our business. And then as soon as we come to the first performance review, we start criticizing them and pointing out where they're not so strong or where they are weaker. But we employed them because of their strengths. So we should really be focusing on how to leverage off their strengths to improve and become even better, rather than focusing on the areas where they're not so strong or where they are weaker. There's a kind of irony in that somehow, that we employ people because of how great they are. And then in the performance conversations, we tell them how weak and how much they need to improve. Owen, yes, welcome. Hi.
Yes, good afternoon, Mark, and good afternoon, the rest of the people on the team. I just wanted to also add, I think you did mention that feedback has to be in the moment. You don't necessarily have to wait for a long period, which I totally agree with. I just wanted to also add that when giving feedback, it also does not have to be formal all the time. Sometimes it's informal, sometimes it's formal. And it's also critical to also include details. Instead of just saying you did a great job or you didn't do well, you should actually use example of situations and actions that took place to say, okay, during that meeting, when you stood up and said this, or during that other activity when you did this and that, then it makes more sense when it's detailed like that instead of it being generalized.
Much more helpful.
Yes.
Yes, thanks, Owen. And certainly this idea of the informal feedback on a continuing and regular basis from people all around you is incredibly valuable. So don't wait for the formal performance review or the midterm or the end of the induction period. Don't wait for those events just to get feedback, but ask people on a continuing basis for informal feedback from your colleagues, from people you trust, or even from people you are supervising. If you are their supervisor or their manager, you can still ask for feedback to be given to you. It's not just something that has to flow down from the top in a formal sense, but the informal feedback is going to give you a lot of information around how you are really doing on a continuing basis. Thanks, Owen. These ideas are really important, and to make the feedback very practical as well, because you want to know what you can change or what you can do differently. Not just that you did well or that you did badly, but what specifically was going to be helpful for me. A couple of other ideas I will share. One is that feedback can always be seen as a gift, positive or negative, or focusing on your value or where you can improve, which is how I like to think about it. It is always a gift. So I think it's valuable to think of it as a gift, even if you think it's a bit more critical. How can I receive this as a gift? Well, thank the people who are giving it to you. Thank you for the feedback is always important, because you've been given a gift to do with what you want. You don't even have to take it necessarily or internalize it necessarily, but if it's given to you, it's given to you as a gift and with the intention of supporting you. So to thank people for giving you the gift of the feedback, I think helps to strengthen the person who's giving it to you. And as we said, some people don't know how to do it well, but always try and thank people who give you feedback, even if you're taking it as a little bit more critical, is valuable. And then there's another thing which I think is important. And this is what I call reframing the feedback, reframing it. Because often it is expressed in a negative way, or in a way that sometimes can feel almost hurtful. And yet there may be some truth in what people are telling you. So is it possible to then in your own head reframe it in a slightly better way or a slightly different way, and to look for the usefulness in the feedback that may be given to you in a rather negative or critical way, but can I still take something useful for me out of the feedback that I've been given? And this is what I would call reframing it. There's this expression that we use sometimes, that every cloud has a silver lining. I'm sure some of you have heard that expression. Every cloud has a silver lining. So I think what you can do is you can look for the silver lining sometimes in the cloud, because there may be in the feedback that you've been given, it's a little bit critical or rather negative, but is there something useful that I can take out of it for me from the feedback that I've been given? So reframing in that sense. And the other thing that goes with that is changing the perception, or reframing it in this sense that you can look at something as bad or difficult, or you could look at it as challenging and exciting. It may be exactly the same feedback, but how you look at it, you can reframe a little bit. So the critical feedback, you could say that actually, I want to see this as challenging for me and as a development area for me. And how could I work in such a way that the same person would give me better feedback next time? So reframing it in that sense, changing how you think about it, and maybe sometimes also changing how you think about the person, because sometimes you could be working with somebody who is giving you rather negative feedback, and then you start thinking badly about them. but actually this person could be a very experienced and skilled person who has worked with people a lot before and who knows and who can see things in you that maybe you cannot see yourself yet. So could you reframe it in such a way that you use this rather critical or negative feedback in a way that you can use it to strengthen yourself? So this is the idea of really reframing and changing your perceptions about the feedback that you get, but also the person who's giving it to you. They are not evil people generally, and they want things to work well. Muketwa, I'm just looking at your question here. Sorry, and Matet as well. You also believe it's important, Matet, to follow up on the feedback? Yes. This may simply involve implementing the suggestions given to you, but it could also mean going back to your manager and saying, look, I heard your feedback last month, and this is what I'm trying to do differently. And am I improving? Are things changing for the better? So to get some further feedback, following up on the feedback can be very valuable. So that again, it becomes a more normal part of a workplace conversation and not just something that happens in a performance review. Muketwa, yes, I also think that people get scared to give feedback because of the positions they hold at work, you're saying. Most juniors are scared to give feedbacks in front of their seniors or to their seniors. Yes, it does happen. When your manager or your supervisor is an emotionally intelligent person, then usually they would be open to feedback themselves, or you just have a normal conversation with them and sometimes ask questions, because asking a question can also be a nice way of giving somebody some feedback sometimes. So you could say, I'm trying to think of a good example. We would really like as a team to have a little bit more of your time, Mr. Manager. There's usually going to be a Mr., obviously. Too many men in senior positions. But to actually say, we'd love to have some more of your time as a team, because you have a lot of value to contribute and to give us feedback can be very helpful for us. So that's something that you could do probably without a lot of fear, just to ask for some more commitment and time from your manager. In a way, you're giving them some feedback that they are maybe too distant or too absent from the team. But to ask it as a question is a nice way then of giving them the feedback that you need them. And you'd like to have some more time with them. It's a way of asking them for their commitment, giving them some feedback, but also showing that they are valued at the same time. Please, sir, can we have a bit more of your time? So I think these are things to practice. It's really important that we get to the stage where feedback can flow in all directions, up and down, side to side, because it is such an important way of learning and growing together as a team and in a workplace. So you have to practice these things. Giving feedback using questions is very valuable. Yeah, please, could we have a bit more of your time? Yeah, or please, sometimes can you just tell us as well what we need to improve on, but please could you also tell us what you think we're doing well at is also valuable. Yeah. Muketwa, does that help a little? Hope so. Okay, we've had almost an hour already. Can you believe it? Time goes very quickly. Other questions then people have? Oh, and you have to leave. I'm sorry. Thank you for being part of it, and thank you for your question earlier. Yeah, I appreciate that. I suppose one of the things I would say about this when you're also speaking to more senior people or managers or whoever, the value of just being yourself and just being normal. You don't have to act or pretend or always to be on best behavior or whatever it is, but just to be normal in the workplace and to be able to have normal conversations, even with people who are more senior with you, can be very valuable and helpful. And usually they are just normal people like you as well. You will become those managers yourself in due course. So don't be like some of the bad ones that you see above you at the moment, but just be normal and have normal interaction in a professional way, obviously, is really important. And as much as possible, integrate feedback, informal feedback, as Owen was saying earlier, is incredibly valuable. Integrate that into your day-to-day conversations. Recognize when other people do well and tell them. And also, if you think there are areas where they can improve, you can offer that support and advice as well. Something that I often do if I'm coaching people or encouraging people with presentation skills. I mean, presentation skills is such an important area at work. We have to be good at presenting. But if I'm going to do a presentation, always to ask somebody beforehand to give you feedback afterwards. So you could say, I'm working on improving my my delivery and my presentation. And if you're going to be in my presentation today, please could you give me some feedback at the end on how you think I'm doing, because I need the feedback. So asking people for feedback in that way is, and priming them to give you, asking them beforehand to maybe even make some notes to give you some feedback at the end, is very valuable for you, and also helps the other person to feel valued as well, because you give them a role and something important and valuable to do. So it goes around in that sense. And you never know, next time they may say the same to you. Mark, could you give me feedback on how I'm going to do with my presentation? Because it's also going to be important for me to receive feedback. So then we start making these feedback conversations normal and normalized in the workplace. Yeah, and we start building a culture in the workplace where feedback is given in a good way, with the aim of helping people to improve always and get better. Thoughts, questions? Yeah, please don't be shy. If you've got a question, you'll probably find somebody else in the room has the same question. So it's okay to articulate it. Nicolette, we haven't heard from you. How do you think? What do you think so far? Noluchando, what do you think? Does this make sense? Is it helpful? Oh, Noluchando, question. I mentioned earlier that feedback from your senior is the most important. My question is, what happens if every other feedback you've gotten is positive, but your senior's feedback is negative all the time? How does one deal with that? Okay, that's a really good question. I think if all the other feedback that you get, presumably from colleagues or other people, is positive, firstly, you could probe some of it a little bit to ask some of the people who are giving you positive feedback a little bit more, if they can also identify some other areas that you could improve. That would be one thing, or strengthen. And then see how that lines up with what your manager may be saying to you. So that's like getting a, what do they call it, a triangulation perspective. So you could even with somebody you trust say, look, my manager always gives me this negative feedback. What do you think about it? Do you think that my senior is right or has got it wrong? Or so I get another perspective, or get another angle. I think that's what I would say. Some people are just generally negative, don't know how to give good feedback. And sometimes you just have to accept that in life, that there are some people who are only going to work in a negative way. But if you know that your performance is good and essentially strong, then you need to internalize that and work with that energy, that actually you are performing okay in this working environment, even if my manager tends to be a rather negative person. So reframe it in that sense, and maybe also think about whether there is some feedback, some of the feedback from your manager, even if it's a bit negative, is there some of it that could maybe be helpful for you? Because probably there may be some little bit of truth somewhere in all the negativity. And can you find those little aspects or those little gems of truth that could be helpful for you as you work with your manager? So to think about how you could maybe work in such a way that you start to change the feedback that you're getting from your manager. Yeah, this is about managing up then, managing your manager. How can you change? What can you do to change your own performance in such a way that they start to be less negative or critical? Not always easy, but worth trying. And sometimes it works. Sometimes it works. Really good question, Olutanda. Thank you. Do you feel that you're in this kind of situation, the person who's giving you negative feedback is just negative generally? Are they a negative person? Or are they picking on you? Or what do you think? Because it could be a variety of different things. Yeah.
Hi, Mark.
Yes, hi.
It's not necessarily a situation whereby I found myself in it, but it's something that I've observed. So I was just asking in general because, you know, it's tough. Like you said, it's a difficult situation to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah, and some people are just generally negative. And in your professional working lives, you will always, at some point, you're going to come across people like this. So you have to know how to deal with it. But getting feedback from other people and checking is always valuable. Check, what do other people think?
Yeah, true.
And then internalize what's important for you, and don't let the fact that you have a negative boss or critical manager bring you down. And the way you do that is by just getting feedback from other people and knowing what you are good at and knowing what you're
basically taking the positive out of it.
Yeah, and also sometimes taking the area, knowing the areas where you do need to improve is also valuable.
Okay.
But at least getting real feedback from real people all around you, not just critical people.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nolitando. Yeah. Debbie, any questions that you have? I'm opening it up now because there aren't many of us. Or anyone. The questions are really valuable for me because then I'm able to focus on supporting you with real situations, real scenarios that you face or could at some stage face in the workplace. So the questions are great. You know, often in my coaching work, I'm coaching people. Even yesterday, I was coaching somebody who's dealing with exactly how to deal with negative feedback from their boss. And we spoke a lot about reframing the feedback in a way that can be helpful. And she was about to have the conversation last evening, 4:30. So we spoke at 12 o'clock. She was having a difficult feedback conversation with her boss. And we spoke a lot about the need to reframe it. Were there some areas that she could take from the negative feedback that would actually be helpful for her? And then this morning I received a message from her saying that that had been very helpful and that she's got a plan in terms of how she's going to respond to the feedback going forward. So that was a very valuable way to reframe that actually worked for her. And the other thing that I said and encouraged her to do before the conversation, I mean, this was a fairly formal feedback conversation. I encouraged her beforehand, just go for a walk around the block, drink some water, calm yourself before you actually go into the conversation so that you feel your head is in a good place. You've cleared other things away from your mind by just going for that walk around the block. Drink some water and feel in a good place when you go in for the conversation. So that's around mind, body, spirit stuff. But prepare yourself well for the conversation that you could sometimes be a little bit nervous about. But be physically ready to have the conversation when you go in there, rather than just rushing from your laptop straight into the meeting when you've got lots of other things also on your mind. Doesn't really work so well. So also to think about that kind of thing can be useful. Yeah. Other questions? Do I have any books? Nolene, thank you. Do I have any books that I could recommend reading on the topic? I can't think of a particular book, but what I do think is useful is to try to understand appreciative ways of working. And you could probably, any of you could Google appreciative feedback. And you might well get some good tips or advice from reading about appreciative feedback. Because, you know, the appreciative idea is always going to see the glass as filling up and as at least half full, whereas the more critical ways of feedback sort of tend to look at the glass as always half empty. It's the same glass, but you do decide to look at it as half full or half empty. Is a mindset approach that people have. And a lot of the ways people work as well is with what I call a deficit approach, looking for the problems and looking for the difficulties and looking for what's wrong. And that's very prevalent in the workplace. And it can be undermining, devaluing, and as I said earlier, what you focus on grows. So if you focus on the problems and the difficulties, you'll find many in any work situation and with other people. You'll find lots of problems or things they don't do well because you have a deficit mindset looking for the difficulties and the problems. Whereas if you take an appreciative mindset, it's the opposite, which is to recognize that there is always potential in a human system, that people can do great things, and we want our teams and people to do great stuff here as well. Again, it gives you a totally different mindset as to how you approach our working environment. So looking up that kind of appreciative feedback idea is helping you to step into the an appreciative way of working instead of a deficit way of working. You're looking at the same stuff. It's just how you look and the eyes with which you look at a situation can be very different, even if you're looking at the same thing. And how you look at it will change what it looks like as well. So if you think that people can be great, then the first person who walks into your room is great. Whereas if you think people are such a problem and if only we didn't have people in this company, everything would be wonderful, then the first person who walks into your room is just going to confirm that perception. So it's how you look at a problem or a situation. defines how it will unfold, usually. So changing one's mindset about this and adopting the idea of appreciative feedback can be incredibly valuable. Thanks, Nolene, for that. I've probably said about as much as I can say on this topic of feedback. So I just want to see if there are any further questions, and then maybe we'll do a round in which you can all give me some feedback in terms of how we've done today. But are there any other questions that any of you have? Debbie, you're covered, I think. Neo, you're covered. Thank you. Maybe just say how this has been today, what they take out of it. Helpful feedback for myself and for Nolene as well. So, yeah, Nolene, do you have any feedback or any thoughts about today?
Thanks, Mark. As I said earlier, I think it's a very valuable session. I've often come out of appraisals and meetings with bosses and other colleagues feeling absolutely devastated by the negative feedback I've got. So this was very valuable, not just for younger people, but for old people like myself too. It would be interesting to hear what the people in the audience, our delegates, feel about these kind of mentoring circles. Are you finding them valuable? Would you like us to do them in a different way? Or any other feedback would be lovely.
Thanks, Nolene. Yeah, who would like to go then? Neo.
I do actually have a question about the nature of these talks.
Okay.
I would like to know if these could be an opportunity for us to ask more personal questions next time that are relevant to us, rather than talk about general concepts. For example, in this talk, I might have talked about literally what happened in my course last week, and if that would be appropriate for these mentoring talks. Especially since today there are so few of us, I kind of enjoyed it. It felt a bit more intimate.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. And yeah, I think it's very valuable if people bring in real situations that they are coping with. And sometimes they will also be personal as well. But I think this is something that we can think about and talk about. Nolene, something we can take on. But I think it's really valuable for people to bring in what has happened or situations they are confronting as a learning opportunity for all of us. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we do have some time now. Do you maybe want to share that now?
I don't have anything important to share right now. I was really asking for the next mentoring talk.
Yeah.
Thank you. We'll take that on board. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Neo. Tabo, how did you find it? Yeah.
To me, it was also very helpful because I think I don't know if it was late for me to hear about or to listen to this talk, because I used to have a lot of negative feedback, if I can categorize it in that part. But then at that time, you would be devastated after that comment. But then only if I knew that, or if I was able to attend this thing earlier or maybe sometime before, I would know that the feedback are sometimes negative and sometimes positive. They're not always positive. Like, thank you for a nice presentations. And then on the other side, I was able to pick up a few also in terms of categorization. Yes, we do get a lot of feedback from different people, from different groups, and then from there, we are able to come up with a categorizing stage of saying these ones are related to this way. For example, on my site, in most cases when I present, I'm making a lot of noise. So so the most common feedback that I got was, you are very loud. So it's that I'm still working on that, but it's unfortunate whenever you're doing the mouth and also the voice box, they don't have a volume so that you can say, no, today I'm presenting at level 4, today I'm presenting at level 5, depending on the group that you are presenting to. So yeah, and then I'm still working on that, but then yeah, surely one day I'll be able to know the group and also try to adjust the frequency of the sound to actually the group in order to accommodate everyone, because they usually say, no, everything is okay, but we have a problem with noise, because at the end of the day, you start well with lower frequencies, but then as time goes on, you start to increase the frequency. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Trevor. Very interesting. Yeah, thanks a lot. Debbie. How did you find today? Oh, you're saying in the chat, thank you. It was a great talk. I like how interactive it is. I know I'm one person who's greatly affected by negative feedback. And this has taught me about how to give feedback to people and how to receive feedback as well. Thank you very much. That's really useful. And I think to think of yourselves as people who will receive feedback in your working lives, but also have the opportunity to give it, and to give it in a way that you would also like to receive it as well. So you practice giving feedback in an important way that other people will take on board and be willing to hear. Yeah, so you are both receivers and givers of feedback. Thank you very much. Yeah. Nolutando, you covered. What did you think about today?
I think it went well. It was a good presentation. And for me, I think what I'm taking home is the fact that not all feedback needs to be positive. You also need negative feedback so that you can be able to improve yourself. So basically, I think that's what I'm taking home, because most of the time when you get negative feedback, you start getting discouraged. So for me today, it just highlighted that not all negative feedback is meant to crush you, but only to improve you.
Yes, often people are not, I'm not saying always, but most of the time people are not trying to crush you. And to think of the negative feedback sometimes as potentially developmental for yourself is useful. Yeah.
Yes, true.
We'll always have some people who are critical. There are always going to be some people who try and bring you down or whatever. And if it's the only feedback you ever get, it can be very discouraging. So to look for feedback from other people as well, not just the negative people around us.
That's true.
Yeah. Thanks, Nolutando.
Thank
Mate,
you.
yes. Mate, any feedback for today?
Hello.
Yes.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Like Tawo said, it would have been better if we received this kind of talks earlier on, especially in our varsity years, where we had a lot of presentations and a lot of feedbacks from our supervisors. But I guess it's never too late to learn new things, especially these talks about getting feedback. And one point that I ran with, that I'm running with today is we really have to be open to feedback, because often there is more than one way of doing some things, and others may have a completely different view on a given topic. So you might get the opportunity to learn something worthwhile from feedback. Yes, thank you.
That's great. That's very helpful. Thank you. Yeah, yeah. It's always a learning opportunity. Nompumelelo, yes. How was today for you?
It was really informative, Mark. Thank you so much. And for me, it came at a really a great time in my career. I've just stepped into a new role where I have been getting a lot of negative feedback because I'm still learning, and at times it was, getting me down a bit. I've been doing a lot of presentations, and it always seems like with every presentation I'm getting a new feedback, which is not always that positive, and just been trying to adjust to that. So this came at a really great time for me, which also just brings me to what Nolene said. Like if maybe we could maybe have like a platform where we can like maybe suggest sort of like issues that we are going through as the mentees, and like maybe you can plan these talks around those. That would be great, because this one was actually very perfect for me. It's actually what I'm actually going through at the moment. So yeah, thank you.
Okay. Good, and thanks, Nompumelelo. And I think it's very helpful to maybe give some input and some feedback to Nolene in terms of what would be good topics to explore in the future. And maybe even we have one or two completely open sessions when people can bring questions that they have without having a topic. So that's also another way of doing these mentoring circles, is to have an open forum sometimes. Nolene.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, Mark. So perhaps our next session should be one of those open ones. If you recall, we did the Ask Your Colleagues one a little while ago, where you just ask your friends and people that you work with, because we're all going through the same things. So we could have another open session, I think, Mark, for the next one. What do you think?
I'd be very happy with that. And then if we do that, then I would encourage all of you who are participating to bring your questions and don't be shy, and help to set the agenda from the beginning. Will be very helpful. Because otherwise you just end up listening to me all the time, which is probably not the best thing always.
Because a lot of people are shy and they don't want to ask the questions, but a lot of people have the same question. So it's a fantastic platform for getting your question answered without you actually having to ask it.
And there are no consequences here. No. Nobody's going to fire you for your question. Yeah. Thank you. I think we're more or less done, everyone. Thank you very much for the questions that you did bring and the chats as well. I really enjoyed it, and these forums also help me to think about what is important and the questions that people are facing at work. So I want to also say thank you to all of you for today. No, thank you for your message. Yeah.
And thank you, Mark, for doing these for us. They are so valuable.
Great. So I think we're rounding up now, Nolene. That's our end for the afternoon. Thanks everyone very much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Mark. Have a fantastic afternoon. Everybody else, thank you for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye. Mark, you need to end the meeting.
Bye.